We just finished a Super Bowl here in this country, the biggest sporting event bar none right here in the United States of America. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers were successful over the Kansas City Chiefs. Tom Brady won his seventh Super Bowl ring, even though it was already established he was the greatest of all time. This just cements it even further, winning his seventh. And on top of that, being the first quarterback ever to win in both conferences. And on top of that, he won on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which are historically not a very impressive organization at all. So congratulations to Brady and to the players on the Bucs. Special shout out to Jason Pierre-Paul, who yet again did it with the pass rush. Did it against the Patriots when he was a Giant and now has done it with the Buccaneers. 8-0 in the postseason. A lot of New York sports headlines are talking that up as if that means a lot, but still, for him, it's his second ring, so it definitely means a lot. Now, a lot of YouTube creators were definitely waiting for the woke advertising to be the story of this week. I can't lie, I was expecting some pretty cringy and pretty awful commercials. And to be perfectly honest, the commercials did not deliver in that regard, and I think that's a good thing. Now, I think the reason why the commercials weren't so woke is because Joe Biden is the president of the United States, so there's no need to virtue signal against President Trump now that it appears that his era is completely over. However, while the politics of the woke weren't really that present in all of the advertisement as it's been in the past couple of years, that doesn't mean there wasn't some woke nonsense we had to deal with leading up to the Super Bowl. And I'm specifically talking about how the entire marketing campaign for the 2 weeks between the championship game and the Super Bowl were all about how Tom Brady once had a MAGA hat in his locker in the year 2015, and how people are so nice to Tom Brady because he's white. This is heavily implied, if not outright stated, but they were so mean to Colin Kaepernick just for kneeling on the field. Tom Brady is this terrible guy who once got a hat from somebody that he considered a friend who was running for president, and that hat was seen in his locker room. But Colin Kaepernick, A-plus first-class citizen all the way. No way we should be treating Colin Kaepernick like this terrible human being when we're just glorifying Tom Brady. Tom Brady, the amount of headlines that had his name and white supremacy in them really go to show you that he's possibly not really at all a white supremacist because he once had a MAGA hat. But Colin Kaepernick didn't do nothing. Colin Kaepernick, great guy, first class all the way. This was the story, or the number of stories leading up to this Super Bowl, and it was absolutely ridiculous. First and foremost, it takes away from Patrick Mahomes, the young up-and-coming quarterback who just won a Super Bowl last year, who was going for a 2-for-2. Andy Reid, a storied coach in the NFL, one of my favorite people in the NFL, going for his second back-to-back Super Bowl after finally breaking through last year. Andy Reid, if you haven't seen some of the losses that he has had as a coach in the playoffs, some of the most tragic stuff has happened to him on the field, and that's not even to mention all of the tragedies that have happened to Andy Reid off the field. However, the Chiefs were basically a non-factor in a lot of the media coverage leading up to this game because, again, we had to retread the Colin Kaepernick nonsense. Now, I have been pretty straightforward, upfront, and honest about Colin Kaepernick in a way that a lot of people on the right weren't actually being, in my opinion. In that, while I do acknowledge that Colin Kaepernick was not a good quarterback at the time that he was exiled from the NFL, I have to also point out that he was definitely good enough to be a backup or a third-string quarterback on NFL teams, and if not for his politics creating a giant distraction and negative PR for the NFL, he likely would have had a job. This is all but acknowledged by the NFL when they gave him a settlement and they gave him a tryout. However, this does not make Colin Kaepernick a good guy, and it should not, in any way, shape, or form, make him viewed as a better figure than one Thomas Brady, because Tom Brady has not done nearly the awful things that Colin Kaepernick did. And I'm not talking about the kneeling. I always, from the beginning, never cared about Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem because that's very symbolic and it doesn't really have a lot of impact on my life. If he's an anti-American regressive, that's on him. And talking about the way that he protests is a distraction from the fact that Colin Kaepernick believes, says, and does horrific things. Attack the person and what he's actually advocating for over the method was always my position on Colin Kaepernick. And that's what I'm going to go into today because I'm tired of people trying to flex with Colin Kaepernick's morality when he has no moral leg to stand on whatsoever. But first, let's get into Tom Brady. Now, I am a New Yorker. I'm a New York sports fan. If anybody has a right to hate Tom Brady for football reasons, it is me. So I totally understand people hating Tom Brady for on-the-field football reasons. In fact, one of my favorite segments leading up to this Super Bowl was Tom Brady reacting to mean tweets, because all of the mean tweets, even though they were nasty towards Tom Brady, acknowledged that he's probably a good guy and they actually wouldn't hate him if he was the quarterback of their team or if they met him in person. But they hate him because if you are an NFL fan and you're not a Patriots fan, at some point in your life as a fan, you have been hurt by this man because that's how good he is. That's how dominant he's been over the last 20 years. Unless you're a Giant, then you have no real reason to hate Tom Brady because you beat him twice in the Super Bowl. But almost every other team in the NFL has a reason to be against this person. But that's all on the field stuff. That's like hating Michael Jordan if you're a New York Knicks fan or an Indiana Pacers fan. You just don't like this guy because he's beating you time after time. That 100% makes sense. But this weird extra hatred towards Tom Brady because he's a successful white quarterback, and the reason I'm bringing that up is because it's brought up in every hit piece against him, who may or may not support President Trump, even though he was just having a MAGA hat in his locker because he was friends with the guy when he decided he was running for president. This is where things get absolutely ridiculous, because you should be able to support the major political candidate for one of the major political parties. You should be able to support somebody who became president of the United States. You should not be shunned from society and called a racist because you might support a guy that 75 million Americans voted for. I mean, honestly, the fact that the media had to project their hatred for President Trump onto their Super Bowl coverage was absolutely terrible. The fact that they had to inject every single bit of it with their politics really ruined the build-up to this big game, which again should have been all about Tom Brady going for number 7, trying to do it without the New England Patriots and Bill Belichick. And then on the other side of this young up-and-comer Patrick Mahomes, who already did it last year, and Andy Reid, who just broke through last year trying to go for it again. This is what should have been the storyline of this Super Bowl. One of the best teams all season versus one of the hottest teams, but it wasn't. It was all about how Tom Brady, even not wanting to talk about politics, was indicative of white supremacy. Even though the most famous person for not talking about politics and being a great player was Michael Jordan, who Tom Brady just passed in a number of championships, by the way, and nobody labeled Michael Jordan a white supremacist for not getting involved in the day-to-day minutia of politics. But where things got ridiculous was when they decided to go full-blown character assassination while propping up Colin Kaepernick, because again, while you can criticize Tom Brady for on-the-field stuff and even cheating scandals in the NFL, like Spygate or Deflategate, which ultimately are not the reasons why Tom Brady is one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, but that's all fun and fair game among fans, just like talking up the Houston Astros pitch stealing scandal would work for baseball. You can't really get him on off-the-field stuff. The idea that he had a MAGA hat, again, as I've referred to a bunch of times in this video already, is just not going to cut it. But to compare him to Colin Kaepernick, who didn't just kneel on the field, which made some people angry, but actually is actively promoting bad causes and horrific people with his activism, is absolutely ridiculous. And I'm going to give you some examples of things Colin Kaepernick actually did. Now, we all know that Colin Kaepernick is an anti-American regressive who has become a symbol of Black Lives Matter, an organization responsible for, or an ideology responsible for, the unparalleled acts of violence, looting, and destruction in all of our major cities over the course of the year 2020. But you also must remember that Colin Kaepernick, when he was a player, actually went down to Miami with a pro-Fidel Castro shirt. So Miami, which is a place where a lot of Cuban refugees are, refugees of Fidel Castro, was an appropriate venue for Colin Kaepernick to wear a shirt praising the authoritarian dictator responsible for forcing them out of the nation or for them fleeing through shark-infested waters in order to get out of that nation. But it actually gets much worse than that, Because while we have a bunch of commies and tankies all over the place, and you might say even though they support one of the most authoritarian ideologies humanly possible, they might not be bad people, they might just be incredibly dumb, Colin Kaepernick actually took it a step further when he tried to free a convicted cop killer who is 100% guilty named Mumia.
When I was invited to speak on behalf of Mumia, one of the first things that came to mind was how long he's been in prison. How many years of his life have been stolen away from him, his community, and his loved ones. He's been incarcerated for 38 years. Mumia has been in prison longer than I've been alive. When I first spoke with Mumia on the phone, I did very little talking. I just listened. Hearing him speak was a reminder of why we must continue to fight.
Now, for some reason, whenever we discuss Colin Kaepernick, this story does not get enough attention. But this guy actually cut a video in favor of this cop killer who, as I pointed out to you, is 100% guilty of killing a cop. And the reason that Kaepernick did so is because this cop killer is a black person who killed a white police officer.
Even while living in the hells of the prison system, Mumia still fights for our human rights. We must continue to fight for him and his human rights. Mumia is 66 years old. He is a grandfather. He is an elder with ailments. He is a human being that deserves to be free. Now
just imagine any circumstance whatsoever where Tom Brady could get away with being an advocate for a convicted murderer based on the fact that that murderer was white and the victim of that murderer was black. Also based on the fact that that murderer himself was a racist. You think Tom Brady could get away with that? Well, Colin Kaepernick just did so, and he was even called out by CNN in regards to his thoughts on the case because it's so open and shut. It's incredibly stupid that this guy got on board with it, but then again, when you view the world through the racist lens that Kaepernick views it through, you can understand why he decided to get on board with this convicted cop killer.
I see that you've just called for the immediate release of this convicted cop killer, claiming that he was framed by a racist police department for the 1981 murder of Officer Danny Faulkner.
He had no record before he was arrested and framed for the death of a Philadelphia police officer.
This is a subject I know a little something about. You could say that I literally wrote the book. This book. 2008, I co-authored Murdered by Mumia with Danny Faulkner's widow, Maureen. It was briefly a New York Times bestseller. By the way, neither of us accepted any proceeds from the sale of the book.
So credit where credit is due to Michael Smerconish of CNN. And again, I am praising somebody on CNN for being so on point on this, because he calls Colin Kaepernick out straight up on his network unapologetically because he actually knows what's going on with this case, because he literally, with the wife of the slain officer, wrote a book on this case.
On December 9, 1981, at about 4 a.m., 25-year-old Daniel Faulkner was executed while making what seemed like a routine traffic stop. Faulkner pulled over the brother of Abu Jamal, a.k.a. Wesley Cook, who was driving his car the wrong way on a one-way street. Abu Jamal was then working as a taxi driver. He saw the police stop from across the street. And 4 eyewitnesses testified at trial as to what happened next. Their testimony portrayed a horrific sequence. Abu Jamal ran across the street, shot Officer Faulkner in the back, and then finally between the eyes.
So as Michael over at CNN points out, there were 4 witnesses that testified to seeing Mumia approach this officer, shoot him in the back like the coward that he is, before he turned around and shot Mumia, and then Mumia put the final shot into his head. But not only is Colin Kaepernick backing the killer of Faulkner against 4 witnesses because the killer of Faulkner is black, and the victim in this case was a white police officer, but he's also backing him over the mountains of forensic evidence that prove his guilt.
Before that final fatal shot, Officer Faulkner had himself discharged his gun, hitting Abu Jamal in the stomach. With that bullet, you could say that he confirmed the identity of his executioner. When police arrived, Abu Jamal was still wearing his shoulder holster. The murder weapon registered to him was next to him on the ground at the murder scene. He'd purchased it at a local sporting goods store. Ballistics tests verified that the bullets found in Abu Jamal's gun were the same caliber, brand, and type as the fatal bullet removed from Officer Faulkner's brain. Both men were taken to a local ER. Faulkner was pronounced dead. Abu Jamal was heard by witnesses, including a security guard, to say, "I shot the MFer, and I hope the MFer dies." So the case had eyewitnesses, a ballistics match, and a confession.
So after being shot in the back by the coward that Colin Kaepernick is supporting because Colin Kaepernick is a racist, the officer turned around and fired into the stomach of his murderer. Then Mumia shot him in the head. All of the bullets in this exchange match each other's guns. So basically, both players in this shooting helped identify and solve this case via ballistic evidence.
Whenever I'm educating someone about the case, in addition to what I've just told you, I always like to underscore one fact. Abu Jamal's brother, William Cook, he saw it all. His words to police upon their arrival were, "I ain't got nothing to do with it." And he has never testified on his brother's behalf. Let me say that again. The brother of the man convicted of killing the cop has himself never taken the stand to tell a different story, and he was there.
And finally, as if the testimony of 4 witnesses and the undeniable forensic evidence proving Mumia's guilt wasn't good enough, you also have Mumia's brother, the 5th witness, who refused to testify in favor of his brother. He knows that his brother is guilty. He doesn't want to testify for him because he knows he will go down for perjury if he lies for his cowardly brother that ambushed this police officer before murdering him.
And yet a political prisoner who has since the age of 14 dedicated his life to fighting against racism continues to be caged and lives his life on a slow death row. We're in the midst of a movement that says Black Lives Matter. And if that's truly the case, then it means that Mumia's life and legacy must matter.
That's who Colin Kaepernick is. That's the caliber of person we are discussing when we're comparing Colin Kaepernick to anybody. He's the kind of guy that will support a cop killer who is convicted with overwhelming eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence because the cop killer is black and he talked a little bit about social justice and he only killed a white police officer. Colin Kaepernick, also the same coward, who refused to go on the show with the guy who actually knows anything about the case or meet with the wife of the person who was slain, because why would that matter to Colin Kaepernick? He's all about pushing a narrative. Mumia has an NPR show, and Colin Kaepernick listened to like 2 episodes, and he really is on board with that.
So thank you, Mr. Kaepernick, for listening. I should note, you were invited to be on this program. I was told that you aren't doing any interviews on the subject. You should know that Maureen Faulkner, police officer Danny Faulkner's widow, would love to talk to you about the case.
Now stack up everything that you have on Tom Brady that makes you hate him. Deflategate, Spygate, the fact that he wins a lot. Stack up the things off the field. He took a loan from the government program that everybody took loans from, but since it's Tom Brady, you want to hate him extra for that. And compare that to Colin Kaepernick advocating for a convicted murderer who is 100% guilty based solely on the fact that that convicted murderer is a black activist and he killed a white police officer. And tell me who's the better person. Tell me who's stronger in terms of character. Tell me who we should be looking up to and who we should be looking down on. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Have you even ever heard of this story related to Colin Kaepernick from last November? Do you still think the fact that you might not like Tom Brady on the field outweighs that? Or is the fact that he once had a MAGA hat because he was friends with the guy who was running for president overtake all of Colin Kaepernick's negative and destructive racist activism? All your thoughts in the comments of this video. If you liked the video, show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social medias, and support me via my support links also in the description box. This has been me once again talking about Colin Kaepernick. Till next time.